It's really nice to meet you, Sam. Looking forward to this interview.
Nice to meet you too.
That's great.
As well.
I'm Chris Paysinger. I'm an American history teacher, specialized in cultural history. So what I like to look at is like the impact of events on people and people's belief systems and what they value. And so to me, the Spanish flu and the current pandemic is super interesting, because what it's ultimately showing is what people care about and how they react to positive and obviously negative things that happen.
When hearing about the Spanish flu, I always hear about deaths and how infectious it was, but I don't really hear anything about the solutions. So what solutions were attempted during the Spanish flu pandemic?
You know, it's what you're really looking at the time of the Spanish flu in 1918, it was still ultimately the medical Middle Ages. And so their efforts to stop and to even understand what's going on, I think we can't really comprehend in 2022. And so some of their methods were very, very crude. For example, they felt that, that maybe the dust carried it. And so that they would wet city streets in an effort to keep the virus from spreading. Very, very, what we would maybe even consider like archaic methods.
Now, how do those solutions compare to the solutions that we're doing now with the COVID-19 pandemic?
You know, even though in 1918 they were very much struggling to understand what was going on, maybe the reality is in 2020, we weren't so far removed in trying to understand this new virus and how it spread. I distinctly remember, the idea that it spread through contact, and the people were out trying to find antibacterial stuff in an effort to kill it. And of course, I think we all bought into the fact that maybe we did know a lot about it, when in reality, scientists at the time were very much searching as much as the scientists were in 1918, 102 years prior.
What do you know about case spikes during the Spanish flu?
Case spikes during the Spanish flu were really ultimately just like what we've experienced with the Delta variants, the Omicron variants, where it was these waves of spikes that would take place. And in some there were very few deaths, and in others there were significant numbers of deaths in these situations. I remember many years ago, I was on my way to Tennessee, and I was driving an old truck, and I was working for someone, and the truck broke down, and it broke down at this little church. And so while I was waiting on someone to get there, I walked through the cemetery that was beside the church, and it was absolutely full of entire families that died in 1918. And of course, even though I was relatively young at the time, I loved history, and I correlated it to, this is the Spanish flu rippling through this small rural Tennessee community. And I can't imagine what the people in that little community thought or even understood, and most especially did not understand about this infectious disease that's going around and killing entire families at once.
How did the Spanish flu ultimately end? You hear about how it killed a lot of people, how it was infectious, but you don't hear about the end of it. So how did it ultimately end?
The Spanish flu really ended suddenly. Something that, obviously the people of the world had lived with for, some time, and really it disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. And we know today, of course, that was because herd immunity happened. And when that herd immunity happened, when enough people had been infected, overnight it almost ceased as quickly as it began. And I think people were probably terrified for years after that there would be another spike, probably much like we will today. That, if this Omicron variant has kind of run its course, are we waiting for that next variant that's going to be overly infectious? And ultimately, I think even scientists and experts don't know that right now.
What solutions were attempted during the Spanish flu pandemic?
In 1918, I think it's very important for us to think about the Spanish flu from the perspective of maybe what they did not know. And so some of the efforts early by the doctors in the medical world, you're looking at the medical Middle Ages really. They didn't understand infectious disease. They didn't understand how things spread. And so a lot of the early things were really them just grasping for straws. In Athens, Alabama, I was reading the other day that they did something where they watered the streets. And they did that purely because they believed maybe the dust carried the virus. They didn't know. So I think a lot of times what we've got to think about with something from the perspective of the Spanish flu is the fact that the medical world was still trying its best, and they had no tools and skills really to be able to know how to stop it. Very early in the Spanish flu pandemic, experts in the field were really not experts. They only knew so much. And so those very early efforts at stopping the spread of something that they really didn't understand how and why it spread were really, I think it was a scattered effort at first that became a little more systematic as time went on. For one thing, of course, the Spanish flu spread like it did purely because the time in which it existed, which was the height of World War I, which was the absolute perfect super spreader event. You've got people from all over the world converging in places and then dispersing from places. You have people packed on ships. You have people moving by train. And so the ability to really wrap their hands around the spread of the disease, I think, was severely limited by the fact that it was during a world war. And the ability to just stop the war, like we just most recently stopped the world 2 years ago, they couldn't do it. They couldn't quarantine at home necessarily. The people maybe on the home front could to some extent, but nothing that would necessarily be effective.
How effective were those solutions in stopping the Spanish flu? And how do they compare to solutions attempted during the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think the efforts to stop the spread of the Spanish flu were not very good. And of course they weren't very good because they just didn't understand the spread. They didn't understand things today like that we fully understand and the medical world has their handle on, which is infectious disease rates and positivity rates and things that we can really drill down into. They didn't have those tools to be able to make even informed decisions. So it's purely a guess on their part as far as the infection rate and how to stop the spread. As far as how were those things comparable to the most recent pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, we have the best medical technology, medical engineering, medical research at our disposal. It's a worldwide process to find that out now. And even we stumbled, I think, very early in that process to be able to control the infection rates. So, it's kind of ironic that, 100 years removed from the Spanish flu pandemic, that those very early efforts, I think, were similar, where we're just trying to get a handle on the best ways to stop the spread of this pandemic. And I'll even admit, very early, I didn't understand very much about it. And I probably should have known more about it being an airborne virus. But very early, they were doing things like, well, when you go pump gas, you've got to sanitize your hands because the person previous to you could have COVID. And so now I don't think that's necessarily as much of a concern, but it's ironic that even 100 years removed from the Spanish flu, I think we operated with as much trepidation and misinformation as maybe they did in 1918.
What do you know about the case spikes during the Spanish flu?
It's ironic that in 2022 we're still experiencing case spikes and different variants. The same thing existed in 1918. There were ultimately 4 waves of the virus that came through. The first wave not necessarily significant, not a significant number of deaths. The second wave, however, was the one that was by far more fatal. And so viruses, it's just the very nature of the virus, of a virus. And so we're not so far removed necessarily from the situation in 1918 as they saw wave after wave after wave wash over the world, and different mortality rates. And so, you can imagine in the medical Middle Ages in which they existed, their ability to try to make sense of this ebb and flow of the virus and death and symptoms, in which some waves were not so bad and others were horrific and extremely deadly. And so, even today, I think we see the fact that viruses are a very difficult thing to forecast.
So how did the Spanish flu eventually end?
The Spanish flu, as quickly as it came, it ended. And I think a lot of it had to do with that positivity rates, which is a phrase that we use today a lot. Infection rates, again, a phrase that we use today a lot, at the time would probably not have been a part of the vernacular. But the Spanish flu, as soon as it began, poof, it was almost as if it was gone. But the reason being, and everything that I've ever read about it, it had to do with that infection rate. It was that herd immunity that we've discussed some, that you hear, experts like Anthony Fauci talk about. So the herd immunity happened so fast because it was such an infectious virus that ultimately enough people in the world had tested positive, or they didn't test positive, they were just positive, or they were just sick, that enough people became sick, or enough people died who did become sick, that it ran its course, just like viruses do.